We are pleased tonight to welcome Gresham Professor of Business, Raghavendra Rau, who is Professor of Finance at the University of Cambridge, and tonight he will be delivering a lecture on who is mining the store, manager, shareholder, conflicts. Thank you. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ryan. So this is the second in my final year series of lectures. I've been giving lectures here for 2 years already. This is my third and final year. And this year's lectures are on the human side of finance. So questions are, when we talk about finance, we talk about contracts, we talk about ways to persuade people to do what we want them to do. But what are the holes in these contracts? How do people take advantage of the holes? That's what I'm trying to talk about in this year's lectures. So let's go back to something I've been talking about continually for the last 3 years, and that is about what finance is all about, right? And at its core, we all know that finance is very straightforward. It's a bunch of promises. Basically, someone is promising to give you a fantastically large amount of money in the future if you give them some money today. So the question, for example, is, as a finance person, how much is each of these promises worth? Right? That's how much do you pay for this promise in the future? Well, if you take rational finance, which is what I talked about last year, it's about, can I figure out what is the present value of this promise? Basically, I compute the cash flows, I compute a discount rate, I use something called a discounted cash flow analysis, and figure out what the value is. However, this year, I'm talking about what happens if you make a mistake in writing the contract. For example, the person may be lying to you. It could be a deliberate lie, in which case it's a fraud, or it could be an incomplete contract. That means there's things in the contract which you might not be aware of, and that allows the other person to take advantage of you legally. So I'll be talking more about the second form than the first one. Stealing money is relatively easy. Designing a contract so that you know what's in it, but your counterparty doesn't, is a little more difficult. So I'll be talking about second more than the first. So if you think about the cycle of finance, this is again something I've been talking about for a while. If we think about the cycle of finance, the way it works is we have the financial markets on the right-hand side over here. We have the firms on the left-hand side, and the firms need the money. Right? They don't have any money. They go to the financial markets, and they make them a set of promises. They say, look, give us some money, and we will invest in all these investment opportunities. Fine. But to guarantee that it will return the money, it issues pieces of paper. That's the essence of what we are trying to get at today. So some of those papers, for example, are debt contracts. You give me some money, and I'll give you back your money, plus I'll give you interest in the middle. Some of those contracts are equity contracts. So give me some money, and I'll give you a share of my profits. If I make a lot of money, you make a lot of money. If I lose money, you lose money. So whatever it is, the financial market values these contracts and then gives the money to the firm. The firm invests that money in assets, creates a bunch of cash flows. Part of the cash flows go to the government, taxes, part is retained by the firm, and the last part flows back to the financial markets in the form of dividends and debt payments. So that's the essential cycle of finance. The problem, unfortunately, is in that cycle, there are a huge number of parties involved. What are these parties? These are the stakeholders in the firm. And the company itself has a bunch of stakeholders. We talked about the investors, and we talked about the firm. But that's just a small fraction of the number of people involved in the firm. For example, you could have the shareholders who hire a board of directors who in turn monitor the managers. But the managers are advised by an enormous number of financial intermediaries, including investment banks, commercial banks, all sorts of financial intermediaries. Now, when we talk about the shareholders, we're essentially talking about the market. So we can talk about individual investors, we can talk about institutional investors, we can talk about hedge funds, merger arbitrageurs. There's, again, an enormous range of types of investors. And, of course, the analysts and other financial intermediaries advise the managers as well as advise the investors, so on both sides of the deal. Beyond this, we can also think of the government. We can think of workers and unions. We can think of competitors. These are this enormous, complex web of relationships. And every part of the web is trying to deal with the other parts of the web. So they're all writing contracts with each other, and they're all trying to make the best of possible deals with all the other people in these different stakeholder relationships. So, if you're an investor, if you're just focusing on the first group of people, the shareholders, what do you really need? Right? First thing is, you want to earn money. That's why you're investing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be buying the shares of the company. So you're earning returns, but you're hiring somebody, like the manager, to do something for you. So maybe they're finding good opportunities for you, good investment opportunities, good share opportunities, but some kind of opportunities. The principal, the shareholders, do not have the expertise or the knowledge of the agents. So they are trying to write a contract which basically says, I don't know as much as you do, but let me write a contract which will somehow prevent you from just stealing my money, okay? Without actually knowing as much as those people do. The problem here is that of asymmetric information. The agent has more information about what the true value is of the contract than the principal who's writing the contract. But the principal is trying to anticipate what the agent might do in order to write a foolproof contract. Well, to give you examples of all of this from their different perspectives. So if you're an investor, who is the agent? Well, last time I talked about banks. I said, well, you don't really need to worry about firms if you can deal with a bank. You just deposit your money in the bank, and the bank will lend money to the different firms involved. You don't have to worry about which firms are doing it. You just worry about, is the bank keeping your money safe? And we talked about things like deposit insurance, things that protect you if the bank goes bankrupt, for example. Today, I'm going to spend some time talking about the managers. So you're looking at the firm now and seeing, how can I constrain the manager? How can I prevent the manager from just stealing your money? Next time, we'll talk about other intermediaries. For example, we can talk about the bond markets, where they lend money to the company, but they're paid before the shareholders. What conflicts do they have? Do they fight with each other? Do they fight with the shareholders? Then we can talk about insurance markets. So they insure the risk of the company. Maybe they insure your risks as well. What information do they have, and how do they prevent you from trying to just, for example, make a fraudulent claim? We have mutual funds. We have hedge funds. We have private equity firms. Each of this has a different set of contracts binding them in place. And so in each of those lectures, I'm going to take a different part of the market and explore what those contracts are. How do you control the behavior of the party on the other side? Fine. So how do you make your agent work for you? Well, if you think about, now remember that we are focusing on managers. So you're focusing on the people who are running the company. So how do you make the managers work for you? There are a number of different ways. For example, you might think of economic controls. Economic controls say, well, if you do well, I will give you more money. That's a performance-based compensation. I can make you one of the shareholders by giving you share-based compensation. So in other words, if you work hard, the shares go up in value, and your incentives are aligned with those of the shareholders. Similarly, I can give you long-term incentive plans that don't pay off unless you do well in the long term, not in the short term. Right? These are all economic controls. I'm placing constraints on your ability to earn money through the company. In addition, we have legal controls. For example, the board of directors is supposed to be watching you to make sure that you're not just stealing the money, right? The managers. You also have, managers have fiduciary duties to act in shareholders' best interests. If you do not act in shareholders' best interest, you could be sued. Similarly, the government has regular financial reporting requirements, disclosure rules, which basically say, every year you have to give me details of exactly what you have done over the course of that year, right? And so each of this, for example, Macy's just announced today that one of its employees had not actually filed their expenses for the last 6 months. So their costs were much higher than reported. And so the employee was basically had messed up. He was fired, but the price of Macy's dropped dramatically today. Right? This was because they were supposed to report the information. Until they actually came up with the idea of reporting the information, they had no idea that the employee was just falsifying all the records. Finally, we have market controls. That means if you really do too badly, you have activist investors coming in, and they will try to take over your company and get rid of you as a manager. Similarly, you have competition in the product markets. Your products aren't very good. There's competition there, and they will wipe you out. And of course, you have reputational concerns. That means you'll never get a job if you've been fired for cause at any company. Right? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because that part there we'll discuss in later lectures. I'll spend more time on the economic and the legal controls today. Fine. Let's take an example. A company we all know and maybe some of us love, right? I don't, but that's me. Okay. Facebook. Now, the interesting thing about Facebook is how does Meta control its managers? First of all, everybody gets a base salary, right? On top of that, they get performance-based cash incentives based on how well they've done in the past 1 year. If they beat particular targets, they get more money. But that is about past performance. How do they ensure that Facebook stays up with future performance? That means, in other words, how do they ensure that the manager works hard to keep Facebook's future performance high? That's the third thing, which they call restricted stock units. And they give a lot of this. So it's equity-based compensation in the form of restricted stock units. Now, what's a restriction? The restriction is that you cannot sell these shares for 4 years. They vest over a period of 4 years, which means that if you do something and the company messes up because of that, right, your shares will go down, and you cannot sell them the moment you have them. You have to work at least over a period of 4 years. This is what it looks like, and so you can pull this straight out of their annual financial statements. There's something called a proxy statement, which they have to file once a year in America, and all this information is recorded there. So they talk about the service period of 4 years, which locks you in to the company for at least 4 years in order for that to be a value. And the amount of money they spend on this is incredible. This is the second highest number. If you look at, it's actually the highest number if you look at all the adjustments to reconcile net income to the net cash which they have to operating activities. The total cash from operating activities is about $39 billion. What they have over here is about $14 billion is only share-based compensation. It's a lot of money which they are putting in to pay these people to motivate them to work hard for the company. So, as I said, they have a vesting period, which means 4 years you cannot get your money. I mean, you cannot sell the shares. They are yours, but you cannot do anything with them for at least 4 years. And they vest quarterly, which means every year you get 1/4 of the shares, right? So if they give you 100,000 shares, 25,000 you actually get after 1 year, 25,000 after 2 years, 25,000 after 3 years, and the final 25,000 after 4 years. If you, again, do it, 1 year later, you'll get another 100,000. They will vest over 4 years. So they are overlapping periods of time. But why do they do it this way? What is the principle behind saying we have a vesting period, but the vesting period is quarterly over 4 years? Would it not be more efficient to say you get nothing for 4 years, and then at the end of 4 years, you get everything, right? It keeps you with the company. The reason you want a vesting period is also not only do you lock this guy into a performance with the company for 4 years, the long term, but you act as golden handcuffs. These people cannot leave, right? If they leave, they give up all their shares. So they cannot leave in less than 4 years. They cannot do things for the short term, get the share price up, immediately leave. They don't have any shares. So there are two types of vesting periods. One called staggered vesting. I'm vesting every quarter, every once a year for 4 years. But there's another thing called cliff vesting. I vest right away. 4 years from now, that's it. You get nothing for 4 years and everything vested together. Which one is more powerful in retaining this employee. Which do you think? Staggered vesting or cliff vesting? Cliff vesting is everything vests at the end of 4 years. Staggered vesting is everything vests 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. Which is more powerful in keeping you vested in the interest of the company? Obviously, it would be cliff, right? Because you don't get anything. If you leave early, you get nothing. And you really have an impetus to keep the value of the shares going up. Unfortunately, Facebook doesn't do that. Why are they giving you money every quarter? At least if you work there for 3 years, you got 3/4 of your money already. You can still leave. You haven't lost that much. So it seems to be weakening the effect of the vesting period. So to understand that, it's an obvious point, is to say, if the company indulges in cliff vesting, what is the incentive of the company? The incentive of the company now is 3 months, 3 years, 11 months, and 29 days from now, they fire you. And so they don't have to pay you anything, right? So the point there is, again, it's a contract between the company and the employee. I want to make you stay, but I can't commit to not taking advantage of that by firing you right before your vesting period comes up. So this is less efficient, but this way I get to keep you at the company, and I give you certain amounts, so I will not have an incentive to fire you exactly at the end of 3 years, 11 months, and 29 days, right? So contracts are written to solve particular problems. There's another possibility, which is options. Now, if you think about options, what an option is very simple. The current share price of the company is $100. If you work hard and get the price of the company above 100, you can buy the shares at $100. If the share price drops below $100, you can still buy it at $100, but nobody will, right? The options are worthless if the share price drops below 100. And that's actually cheaper in some ways for this than giving restricted stock units. Because the company doesn't have to give you anything. It just gives you a promise. You work hard, price goes above 100, I'll give you shares. If it doesn't go below 100, that's fine. You get nothing. Okay? So it doesn't give options. It gives restricted stock units. That means actually giving stock. Why not options? I'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, let's say that options seem to be a cheaper way of achieving the same goal. So why would you give options? Why would you give stock? How do you design the optimal compensation policy is another type of contract which makes these guys work hard for you. But let's start with a simple question. Of all the people at Facebook, who do you think gets paid with these kind of rewards? To do that, I would like to ask you that question. Right? So if you have your phones, go ahead, put it on that one, and you think of all the people at Facebook, who should get paid in the form of these type of rewards? Okay. Entirely. So basically, everybody at the firm should get these kind of this. All employees, good answers. The managers only, Mark Zuckerberg, okay. Elon Musk, I'm not sure he's at Facebook, so but yeah. Exact, okay. The senior leaders, okay. Elon Musk is not at Facebook, right? So let's leave that one out. The directors, all employees, salespeople, board of directors, all good answers. Right? Now, let's start with the answer which says everybody, right? Managers, workers, everybody. The key part is, remember what the purpose of these things are. The purpose of a restricted stock unit or an option is to make you work hard for the company. And that means your effort will influence the value of what you will get. If you work extra hard, the share price goes up, and that's good, right? If you are the janitor at a company, it doesn't matter how hard you work. Your share price is not going to be affected. So not much point giving restricted share units to, say, janitors or another point over here, salespeople. How does Facebook sell? They don't have people picking up the phone and calling other people to say, buy ads, right? Facebook makes money through advertisements. But the process is an algorithm. Basically, they say, if you want a Republican woman living in New Jersey with 2 children who drinks Starbucks lattes in the morning, I can deliver that person to you if you want an ad in that person. But it's an algorithm. You bid for the algorithm. So salespeople are also unimportant. However hard they work, the algorithm is the one which is selling. So it turns out that the people who get paid most are the people who can influence the experience of Facebook. The most important people are R&D, the engineers in the company. Salespeople don't get paid that much. General administrative, they don't get paid. Almost nobody gets paid in the form of options except the engineers and the computer programmers, because those are the ones which can really affect the value of Facebook. So that's a principle of compensation. You do not give compensation in any form to somebody who is unable to affect it on their own life. Right? If you're going to work super hard, but it doesn't affect anything, just give a cash bonus. Just cash is fine. You don't want a contingent award in this particular scenario. Okay, what about CEOs? A lot of you mentioned Zuckerberg, right? How are CEOs paid? Well, if you look at CEOs across the world, the CEOs, there's one country that sticks out from every other country in the world, and that is the US. The others are sort of, I think with the exception of India, Indian CEOs are really badly paid. Well, don't worry too much about this because this is not purchasing power parity adjusted, so they make a lot of money if you think about Indian rupees. But regardless, if you think about the US is dominant across the world in the amount of money they pay. No other country gets paid like that. And most of that money is the blue line over there, which is options. If you think about typical CEOs, like this was in 2021, Peter Kern from Expedia got nearly $300 million in the form of equity or options. Right? Then you have Warner Brothers, ServiceNow, Tim Cook from Apple, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan. All of those, almost all their money is in the form of options. And it's not $1 or $2 million, it's several $100 million. So these guys are really motivated to work super hard for their shareholders, right? I mean, almost everything is in the form of options. The cash part is tiny. So let me ask you a question at this stage, which is, if you pay more in the form of options, do you think the CEO, the firm should perform better? Yes or no? Or irrelevant? What do you think? It's the same code. So if you had that code, it'll be exactly the same code. Right? Otherwise, it's mentee.com, and the code is 13985460. Very nice. Interestingly, the answer is the one which very few people picked. The firm actually does worse, not better. Why is that? That seems weird. It seems counterintuitive. So let's take a look at what is happening. Right? If Americans get so highly paid, they must be the best in the world. So this is research which I did. I looked at all American CEOs in the S&P 1,500, and on a scale, basically, I took every industry, and within industries, so all tech companies, all utility companies, all mining companies, within the industry, I took who are the most highly paid in the form of options and the least highly paid in the form of options. What did I find? The highest 10% incentive pay actually do worse than the lowest 10% incentive pay. That seems weird. I'm giving these guys incentives to work super hard. How come they're not working super hard? Right? Actually, they are working super hard. The problem is I'm attracting the wrong type of person. So if I give you guys a choice, for example, between, say, $20 million in the form of options or $10 million in the form of cash, who would take options? Anyone in this room? Okay. Cash? A lot of hands going up here, right? So the point about this is who picks options? The guys who are confident they can raise the price. Because if you are not confident you're going to raise the price, you would pick cash. So only the confident CEOs accept the option. It's a two-way street. I'm giving you the money, but you have to accept the salary. If I'm not going to accept the salary, no point in me getting this massive number, whatever it is, right? I mean, I don't want it. So the negotiation process is I offer you options, and you say, yes, I'm going to take it. That means your CEO is super confident. And that average of a bunch of super confident people is someone who is extremely super confident. And these guys overestimate their ability to manage the firm and end up doing too badly. They end up underinvesting. They invest in wrong type of project. They take too much risk and destroy value instead of creating value. So the idea here is I'm designing an instrument to do one thing, to make you work hard. But the instrument backfires because I'm not controlling who is taking the instrument versus I assume that everybody will take whatever instrument I give them. Then that's just not true. But what about the markets? Do the markets think that options work? This was a paper published by another professor at the University of Iowa, Eric Lee. And Eric did this study where he showed that if you look at option grants in America, that's a date when the options are granted to the executives. Immediately after that, that happens to the stock price of the company, especially between 1999 and 2002. The moment you grant the options to the executive, the share price jumps. And I saw that as well, and I'm afraid to my eternal shame, I kind of said, oh yeah, that seems that options really work. The market loves the ideas that these guys are getting options. Eric Lee took a slightly different perspective, and he said, wait a minute, let's look at the number of companies which are doing this. And it turns out almost every company in the S&P 1,500 showed a pattern like this. So he said, wait, how likely is it that every company miraculously has their performance go up when options are given? Every single company. How is that possible? He said, a more likely answer is that these guys are giving options. Let's remember what I just said, right? I want to give you something. The current stock price is $100. I want to say, if you increase the price more than 100, the options are in the money, you make a lot of money. But unfortunately, if I do that, you really have to work hard. I want to give you a slightly easier ride. So I say, fine. Instead of it being $100, I will give it to you at 90. You just have to beat 90. You're already beating 90. You're already at 100. So I'm giving you options already in the money. So what these guys did was to go back in time and backdate their options to the lowest price in the previous 1 month. That means they were giving their CEOs too much money, but they didn't want to tell their shareholders. So Eric Lee actually made a ton of money because he was an expert witness in a huge number of cases against these companies because they were all backdating their options. Steve Jobs was one of the people who received backdated options. Everybody was getting backdated options. Right? So unfortunately, this means nothing because all the company was doing was, in a way, like a sharpshooter. How do you guarantee that you will hit a bullseye every single time if you're a sharpshooter? Anybody? Sorry? Exactly, right? You shoot at the wall or whatever, and then you draw a bullseye around the bullet hole. That's what these guys did, right? So essentially, instead of saying you're going to have to beat the $90 benchmark, you backdate it to pretend they started with the $90 benchmark, which is illegal if you do not tell the shareholders. And the second problem is, of course, what happens if the options do not vest? So, for example, you're working for this company, and the share price drops. If it's $100 and the share price drops to 90, if you work hard, maybe you'll get the share price to $100. But let's suppose the share price drops to 80 or 70. Even if you work super hard, it's very difficult to get the share price up. So what would you do as an employee? Well, you find another job, right? Your options are worthless, nothing keeping you with the company. Find another job, move on. Companies know this. So the share price drops because the managers are not working hard. They reprice their options. So in other words, what that means is now the options are back in the money. So these guys have an incentive to work hard again. They can retain their employees that way. But as an employee, if I know that the company is going to reprice every time I go down, the share price goes down, why do I need to work hard? I know the price is going to go down. These guys are going to reprice my option. I just stop working. So the very thing of keeping the employees within the company can also backfire in the sense of these guys know that the company will just change the performance targets on you. Okay, what about bonuses? If the CEO works hard, does that work to keep these guys working hard for you as shareholders? One of my favorite examples is a company called Eastman Chemicals. And Eastman Chemicals had something called the UPP pool, which basically was talking about how much performance they had to achieve in order to receive a bonus. And it looked like this. It said if the threshold was, if they reached 1.01 earnings from operations, $1.01 billion, they get 50% of that bonus. If they reach $1.32 billion, they get 100% of that bonus. And if they reach $1.63 billion, they get 200% of that bonus. So it was all set in stone. It was all written into the contracts. Everything was done. So what do you think the company achieved? Well, turns out that the earnings for operations, remember the target was 1.32. The actual was exactly 1.32 billion. Now, it could be that this is pure coincidence. But when I saw that, I was thinking, man, you got to cheat. At least make it believable, right? 1.33. Why not? My target is 1.32. I hit 1.32. Right? It's like you're treating your shareholders like they're dimwits. Right? In many cases, as I show in a few minutes, shareholders really behave like dimwits sometimes. Anyway, so how is pay set? Right? We've talked about employee pay. We've talked about CEO pay. But how is pay set? Well, the way most companies work is they have what's called a peer group. And the way the peer group is the company says, let's find other CEOs who are running companies like us. Let's look at their pay. And then we will set our pay right in the middle of that peer group. This is the peer group, for example, for Facebook. Right? So here's all the companies on their peer group, and they look at these companies, and they say, let's look at the CEO's pay there, and we'll be in that ballpark. So we know what the market rate is for CEOs. Fair enough. Except, unfortunately, that when do you get a bonus? This is something called the Lake Wobegon effect, after a book by Garrison Keillor, where in a mythical town where all the men were handsome, all the women were beautiful, and all the children were above average, right? Which is impossible, because some children have to be below average in order for there to be an average. But unfortunately, applying this to CEOs, it turns out that every CEO is above average, right? So what does that mean? It means that if you have a peer group where somebody in the peer group gets a bonus, your board of directors says, that guy got a bonus. Now, we can't tell our shareholders we have a genius CEO if they say, oh, yeah, how come he's such a genius? You're paying him peanuts. So you say, if they get a bonus, we have to give our CEO a bonus, even though they did absolutely nothing to deserve it. Right? That's the Lake Wobegon effect. And so it turns out that they pick the peer groups appropriately as well. So, for example, when the CEOs choose their peers, they will pick the worst performing peers. You just have to beat your benchmark. So you pick the right type of peer, the guys who are highly paid and underperforming as your peer group, you're in clover. Right? That's another thing here. Or sometimes they hire compensation consultants, an independent group of people who will say exactly how much to pay your CEO. The way you think about this is a cartoon from Dilbert, where he says, I'd like to meet Bradley, our new manager of executive compensation. Bradley's job is to recommend to a board how much to pay executives such as me. Bradley is totally objective. This guy says, that was a world-class observation, so I recommend the company buy you a pony. A huge pony, a strong pony to carry the huge bags of cash I recommend for you. And this guy said, good work, Bradley. I'll recommend to the board that you get a raise. And so this, basically the whole point is the compensation consultant is actually being paid by the CEO to do other consulting work for them. So the CEO has an implicit threat. You don't pay me more, I don't direct all that money to you on the side, right? So you really are controlling the consultant who is in charge, supposed to be recommending objective measures of your pay. Okay? There was actually a paper which I wrote, which looked at how do we know this is really true? Well, it turns out the SEC said in 2009 that firms have to disclose their compensation, that have to disclose how much they're paying compensation consultant if the consultant also provides other services. That is like a disclosure rule. If you are providing other services, you have to tell the world exactly how much you're paying so that we can know how much conflicts of interest there might be. So what did the consultants do? Immediately, a whole host of them spun off boutique compensation consultants who did nothing except provide compensation advice. And that did not have to be disclosed. You only had to disclose if they had other services. So the firms switched over from using general compensation consultant to boutique compensation consultants where they don't have to tell anybody how much they're paying these people. So everything you do, there's a rule. There's also a way around the rule to do whatever you want. All right, let's go back to Zuckerberg. We've been talking about Zuckerberg for a while. So how much does he get as pay? The answer is not much. He gets $1. That's his salary. Year after year after year, he's been getting $1. I mean, how does the man live? Poor guy. I mean, he does get some perks. So if you look at his perks, he gets about $24 million as perks. Right. What are these perks? Well, he has a private jet. He needs a lot of security, so that's all he gets. But his salary is $1. So $24 million for a private jet. Is that normal? Okay, let's take an example. All right. Let's suppose you guys are CEOs of a large multinational corporation, and you are weighing the purchase of a corporate jet for 200 million pounds to fly you to New York, to San Francisco, Paris, or Shanghai. Right? The jet costs 200 million pounds. The question for you, oops, sorry, let's come back in here. Okay, should you buy the jet? I see you have 2, 3 people who think it's unnecessary, but 15 people of 200 million. No questions. Right? Let me persuade the 3 people over 4 people. Oh, wait, 4 people. Okay, let me persuade the 4 people over here. Right? If you think about the jet, that's a living room on the jet. The carpet is $200 per square foot. That's a bedroom on the jet. That's a bathroom. Right? There are separate sinks for his and hers. Anyone of the 4 people, anyone want to change their mind? The key question is, how do you get this through the shareholders? You're the CEO, this jet, you love this jet. Right? Anyone who doesn't love the jet? Right? You want this jet. How do you persuade the shareholders to give you the jet? Well, you can say very simply, look guys, I believe in shareholder value. I want to do stuff which is good for you guys. And you know what? I'm happy. I'm happy to take the Elizabeth line from here to Heathrow. Right? Crowded peak times, it's awful, but that's fine. I'll do it because I love shareholder value. I'll fly economy, not a problem. Right? So I stand in line at security. I go there. The seat doesn't recline more than 30 degrees. I'm exhausted. People breathing on me from all directions. By the time I get to New York, I'll be so tired that they say, sell me a widget for $1. I'm like, take it. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm so tired. Just do it. But if you let me buy this jet, even when I'm sleeping, I'm dreaming about shareholders. I'm dreaming about giving you money. I get off that plane and negotiate so hard for you guys. You will make 200 million? Nothing. You'll make $200 billion. Right? Great idea. The only problem is, how do you know I'm lying, or how do you know that I just don't want the jet? Right? Anyway, point is, this argument was so powerful that Goldman Sachs, their CEO, David Solomon, when he took over, he said, I want a private jet. Until then, no Goldman CEO ever taken a private jet. They had basically rented jets. And so he said, I'm spending time waiting for these private jets to arrive, the flight delays, all the stuff. This is costing you money. So they did a cost-benefit analysis, and they wound up ordering 2 jets, not one. The second one, just in case the first one had to go for repairs. Right? And he chose the decor himself because he says, I need to be comfortable in that jet. So mine, right? And once you get a perk like this, it never goes away. So CFOs needed corporate jets during COVID. Not a single corporate CFO has said, okay, we don't need a jet anymore. We'll fly business. You got a jet, you keep the jet. Okay, is this excessive pay? Well, one way to think about it is, this is CEO compensation as a percentage of average worker pay. It's now about 350 times the average worker pay. So maybe the pay ratio, so the SEC said, you have to publish the pay ratio. That means you might shame CEOs into getting lower salaries. So if you look at Meta says, the compensation is, the median employee was $379. The annual compensation of our CFE was $24 million. And so this is 64-1, which is much less than 350-1. We are a very democratic company. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you can define your CEOs exactly, your employees exactly the way you want them. If there are any low-paid employees in the company, you have them employed to a third-party provider. You do not employ them yourself, so you do not actually have to report. So only the high-paying employees are on your pay books, and that's why you can report a low number. Literally, anything the government does, you can find a way around it. Right? So anyway, why is Zuckerberg so badly paid? Well, if you think about it, how does he make money? How does he actually survive? Well, one thing he does, of course, is very straightforward. He owns 950 what they call Class A shares, and he owns 344 million what they call Class B shares. And each Class B share has 10 times the voting power of a Class A share. Okay. So he controls 61% of the voting rights of that company. So if Facebook actually paid a dividend, how much would he get? It turns out the total number of shares is 2.1 billion Class A, 0.345 billion Class B. He owns about 9.958 million Class A, 344 million Class B, which is about every dollar coming out of Facebook, he gets 13 cents of that dollar. But he completely controls the company. So in other words, he can do whatever he wants. And as a shareholder, he doesn't bear the risk. The risk is borne by everybody else. He only bears 13% of the cash flow rights. So a big wedge between his personal risk versus his control rights to the corporation. Does he care about anyone else? Well, every year, there's a proposal put by the poor shareholders who say, please give each share an equal vote. And every year, one shareholder says, forget it, not going to happen. And it never happens, right? Because the one shareholder is Zuckerberg. Okay, so one man, all the votes, is pretty much what it is. So what happens here? So Facebook says Cambridge Analytica harvested data of to 87 million users, failed to police how its partners handle data. It deflected, delayed, and denied everything which had been put in front of it. There's a thing put by the Wall Street Journal called the Facebook Files, which said how their platform is riddled with flaws. It says its rules applies to all company documents, reveal a secret elite that is not bound by any of Facebook's rules. Instagram is toxic for teenage girls, but they don't really care about any of that. And most recently, before the AI thing, he was going heavily into Meta, the metaverse. That's why he changed his name, the company's name, to Meta. And what happened to the stock price? As you can see, the free cash flows of the company dropped almost to zero. The key part is people were objecting to any of this, but he said, I don't care. I am in a controlled company, so I can make all these decisions, and nobody else is allowed to do anything. Right? Okay, so is this common? Well, if you think of another company called Snapchat, when they went public, the amount of votes they gave its people who bought their shares was zero. That means if you bought a share of Snapchat, you didn't have any say in how the company was managed. And then, after they issued those shares, people bought the shares, and after that, they decided, what's the point of having an annual meeting? Right? These guys can't do anything, so no point in having a meeting anymore. So they were going to do our own thing. You guys are suckers enough to pay for my shares. I'm taking it and doing whatever I want. So who controls the company is a big question at the end, right? So Ben & Jerry's recently sued its parent Unilever because they sold the entire Ben & Jerry's to Unilever. Unilever owns Ben & Jerry's. But they said, we have an essential nature of the company. We are known for socialist reasons. We are known for talking about things like human rights and dignity, supporting social and economic justice, protecting and restoring the Earth's natural systems. Ben & Jerry's is known for this kind of stuff. So we are going to sell you Ben & Jerry's, but we will have a board, and we control the board, and the board is in charge of controlling the ethical integrity of Ben & Jerry's. So this happened last week when Ben & Jerry's is busy suing its own company again for saying, okay, you're silencing it over support for Palestinian refugees. It happens literally every year. They sue their own company because they say, we are in control of this company. Or let's take another example. Suppose you own 97% of the voting stock of a public company. Do you control it? Yeah, obviously, right? Of course you do. The problem, of course, is what you can do is elect your directors nationally, and you should pick qualified board members, not just friends or your dog, which happened in one case. Right? You have a board of directors, you put your dog on it, because you control the whole thing. But anyway, so you pick qualified board members. The problem with qualified board members is they can still outvote you sometimes. Some controversial thing happens, the board goes one way, you want the other thing. So what can you do if that happens? You control the company, so the obvious thing is fire the board. Get rid of all of them, right? And replace it with a board who will do exactly what you want. The problem is that takes time, right? Maybe there are a whole bunch of things. You've got to follow a set of formal procedures. You might read written consent. You might need to call a shareholder meeting. You might have to wait for the annual meeting. And sometimes the board can act against your wishes or try to take away all your shares. And this actually happened when CBS was trying to, the Redstones were trying to own CBS, were trying to sell CBS to another company, and then the board basically tried to take away their shares and say these shares are no longer valid because they are doing stuff which is selling CBS too cheap to the acquiring company. It didn't work, but they tried taking away the shares. But anyway, the point is, at that time, the company's doing the thing you didn't want it to do, and you just stuck outside, plotting your revenge. So my favorite example of this is one from Canada. It was a company called Rogers Communications. And what happened there was an interesting case, because it turns out there was a CEO of the company called Joe Natale. And Joe Natale and Rogers Communications, Edward Rogers, who was part of the board of directors, did not like his own CEO. So he decided to fire his CEO and replace him with a guy called Staffieri, who was the second in command at the corporation. Now, the point was, Rogers decided to do this by himself. So there is an existing board. The existing board does not know that the chairman of the board is trying to fire the CEO of the company. So how does the CEO of the company find out about this? It turns out that Natale accidentally dialed the guy who was trying to oust him, who forgot to turn off his phone after the call was over. So for 21 minutes, that phone was open while this guy was plotting the coup against how to get rid of the CEO, while the CEO is listening in on the whole conversation. So after that happened, Natale went to the old board, and they said, look, these guys are trying to get rid of me. And the old board said, wait, he didn't ask us. He's the chairman of the board, but he didn't ask any of us. So they went to the family members, who were the other members of the board, and the family members said, we'll support you against this guy. And so they said to the chairman of the board, you cannot fire the CEO. So he fired the board and set up his own board. So for 2 weeks, you had two boards in the same company, and nobody knew who was in charge. One board said, we are in charge, we were the original board. The other guy says, well, I'm the chairman of the trust, which owns you guys. You guys are all fired. I'm in charge on this side. You had two CEOs, two boards of directors, and nobody knew what was going on. This happened for 2 weeks, and so the family was fighting with each other all the way through. Right? They were talking about, enjoy your pretend board meeting, Ed. Here's the problem, it's not legal. I'm going to fight like hell to get rid of you and get back the control for the original one. Eventually, Ed got his way, and Matt Levine had a good title for it. It said, Roger Sherman files board for firing him for firing CEO. Okay, think about another way in which you can make money. The other way is through pyramiding, right? You're again trying to control the company. So you have a family firm which owns 51% of the shares of that company, owns 51% of the shares of that company, owns 51% of the shares of that company. You completely control level 3, but you only have 12.5% of the voting, of the cash flow rights in that company, 51 times 51 times 51. So that means you can do all sorts of things. For example, this is a state-owned company in Italy which decided to sell one of its divisions to a different division. It's like taking a division out of one pocket and putting it in the other. The key part was this was 47% owned by small investors. This was 17% owned by small investors. And the price at which they transferred it was too high. This was an overvalued company. So it turns out the price was incredibly high. And so what happened was the small investors over here were extremely upset. Their value dropped by 20% at the announcement of the deal. But nobody was sued, partly because this is Italy. Right? The Italian government is basically ripping you off in this particular context. Surely other governments are much better. Right? Well, let's take the American government. Right? So we have in Congress, this happened in the Trump first administration, and news reports showed that this Tom Price, who was a nominee to be Health and Human Services Secretary, basically had bought shares in a tiny biotech company while sitting on committees that could influence the company's prospects. So he knew what was happening, and he was passing laws to favor that company while he was holding shares in that company. And people got very upset at this. So what do you think happened? Well, turns out a lot happened. Specifically, 4 other people said, wait, hold on a minute, how come we don't have shares in that company? So they all jumped in to buy shares in the same company. Right? So essentially, as a government holder, none of these guys were ever punished in any way. Right? It's obviously going to be very different with the new Trump administration, don't worry. Okay, so is the board supposed to protect you? Well, not really, right? It turns out, again, in Facebook's case, the board can be replaced if the CEO decides that the board can be replaced. But suppose the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, has a brain fog or suddenly and sells his Class B shares. The board converts to a board which cannot be replaced for 3 years. That means even if the guy accidentally sells the shares, he's still protected. He's put into place every rule he can to protect him under all counts. But my all-time favorite example, of course, is Tesla. Right? So what happened with Tesla? The board of directors pretty much gives Elon Musk whatever he wants. He wanted a secret glass house. They built him a secret glass house, right, for his place. And then my favorite bit was he decided he basically had 25% of the shares of Tesla, but he sold 12% of those shares in order to buy another company, Twitter, on his own personal account, not Tesla's account. And then he bought it, and then he went back to Tesla. And he said, guys, I'm not interested in Tesla anymore because I only have 13% of the control. Give me more shares for free, or I'll develop all the products outside Tesla. You won't get any of it. As board members, what would you do? Right? Do you say, no, you're just blackmailing it? What should prevent you from doing the same thing again? So they gave him his money. Another shareholder sued him. They said, the board is just sitting in this guy's pocket. They're not looking out for us. They're keeping control of the company. So it is voided. And he said, fine, in that case, I'm going to move my whole company to Texas instead of Delaware. So Texas is much more liberal. They will let me do whatever I want. And today, he is now looking forward to serving America if the opportunity arises. He becomes the head of what they call Doge, no relation to Dogecoin, the Department of Government Efficiency, apparently. And he says, no pay, no title, no recognition. What he didn't mention, of course, is when he's working for the government, all his shares can be sold, and he doesn't have to pay capital gains tax on any of those. He can defer capital gains tax for most of those. Right? So at the end, it's very tough to control anything. If you think about OpenAI as one last example, OpenAI has exactly the same issue. It was a charity. And so they said, when they first came out, they said, it would be wise to view any investment in OpenAI in the spirit of a donation with the understanding that we don't really know what money would mean in a post-artificial general intelligence world. Basically, that's a great pitch. It's like saying, give us money, and we won't return you anything. But maybe we'll develop a system where money doesn't mean anything. So you'll have benefited humanity in some way. Unfortunately, the CEO, Sam Altman, didn't feel the same way. So they fired him. And the workers said, hold on, we are interested in money. We are not interested in a wonderful society. So they all decided to follow him. So the board said, okay, we are so sorry. We have nobody left here. So fine, we'll give in to you. So they hired him back and fired everybody else. Right? So again, question of control. Who controls the company, and who is the one who's in charge of making sure that these contracts are in turn fulfilled? Well, if your investors are happy to fund you, my favorite example is WeWork. Right? So WeWork, when it started in 2018, they basically said, we want to transform the way we live, work, and play. This guy said, how do we change the world? Bring people together. It's a wonderful world. Everybody, we're changing the way the world works. And he had the great good fortune of joining a guy called Masashi Son, who decided, I'm going to do something called blitzscaling, which means if you want $40 million, I'll give you $400 million. So he says, being crazy is better than being smart. You're not being crazy enough. Be more crazy. So Newman was crazy. He took $400 billion and then cashed out immediately, took out $700 million, put it in his own pocket. Right? Then beyond that, he borrowed money. He borrowed $362 million to help him exercise those options we talked about to buy stock. And then he just gave the stock back to the company, making money in the process. He even set up his own company called with the name We, and he made his company buy the other company for $5.9 million. Right? So just to get the name We. And then SoftBank eventually said, we've had enough of this guy. They fired him, but they paid him $185 million to make him go away. But the final thing, and the part which is the most interesting, is after WeWork collapsed, the guy says, fine, I will buy you back. I made all this money from you. So the company's worth nothing. So I'll come back. And he went to SoftBank and he said, now give me the money. Give me the company for a very low price. I extracted all the wealth out of it. I can go back in and buy it from you in a very cheap one. Does the trouble stay at the top? The problem is not. Right? Once you have issues, you have problems like this. Wells Fargo, for example, had all these problems. They were trying to put in mortgages, so they were changing your loans unexpectedly. They would have monthly payments for far longer, owe the bank much more money. This is because those guys were basically being paid for giving as many mortgages as possible. So they would just give you unwanted auto insurance. You take a car loan, they'll force you to take insurance through them, which is much more highly priced than any other insurance policy. They would make up accounts. You have an account, you haven't even gotten, they will make an account in your name because you were paid for too many, they were paid for the number of accounts they opened. So many of you may actually, if you're American, may have accounts at Wells Fargo. You may want to check whether you already have an account with Wells Fargo. Right? So, and then they were trying to increase diversity, so people would have fake job interviews. So they would interview a whole bunch of black people or women, and they would, with no intention of ever hiring these people. They were just there to make the pool look bigger. Look, we have looked at all these diverse pool, but we hired the white man. Right? So that was the other issue here. Anyway, overall conclusion. In the last few years, many shareholders, many small investors have lots of money. They desperately want to invest. And the corporate power has shifted from these investors to the founders of these companies. We want to give them money. The old model was a partnership model. Shareholders had voting rights to elect directors. The rights were largely symbolic because unconstitutional elections and so on. Today, it's more like an employer service model. There's the founders keep all the voting power. As a public investor, you get few or none votes. Investors just provide money, get limited returns, and that focusing on increasing sales and headline numbers seems to be fooling investors in the last 5 or 6 years. So that's the issue today, right? How do we control these people who are supposed to be our agents? In the last 5 years, we seem to have given up a lot of that control. And once you give up control, it's extremely expensive to try to get it back. Okay? And so let's stop here. Next time, I want to talk about insurance markets and debt markets and how what the rules are there and how people take advantage of those rules. Okay? And we have time for a few questions, so let's stop here. Thank you.